Good morning. On behalf of the South Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, or SCCADVASA as we are known, I really appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony about how reproductive autonomy and access to abortion care is critical to safeguarding the life, health, and safety of the thousands of people in South Carolina who are trapped in abusive relationships or have been the victims of sexual assault. I'm an attorney from Greenville, South Carolina, and the majority of my 22-year legal career has been dedicated to fighting for the rights of crime victims in South Carolina. I had the honor of standing alongside hundreds of survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, child sexual abuse, and human trafficking as they fought for their right to justice, their right to privacy, their right to safety, and quite literally, their right to simply be alive. Today, of course, I'm here in my role as the General Counsel and Director of Systems Advocacy for SCCADVASA. We are a statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to ending domestic and sexual violence in South Carolina. We are honored to support the work of the other 22 nonprofit organizations and our partners throughout the state, whose advocates directly provide life-saving services, information, and support to victims. As you deliberate today regarding the right to access abortion care in South Carolina, we ask that you carefully consider the rights of survivors of both domestic violence and sexual assault. We ask you to consider their right to live a life that is free from further trauma, free from further risk of physical harm, and free from the risk of being murdered by their abuser. As Ms. Tempio already recognized, pregnancy in an abusive relationship can often lead to the escalation of physical violence and increased risk of death by homicide. Access to abortion care is essential to save the lives of victims in abusive relationships. There is broad consensus that when a patient is facing a substantial risk of death or a substantial and irreversible physical impairment, they should continue to have access to abortion care. Therefore, it is critical to understand the correlation between intimate partner violence, pregnancy, and the dire and often deadly consequences of limiting access to abortion care for people in abusive relationships. In South Carolina, 42.3% of women experience intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or stalking in their lifetime. People living in abusive relationships often do not have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves, including the decision to have sexual intercourse or to get pregnant. In fact, 10.3 million U.S. women have reported having a partner who tried to get them pregnant against their will or refused to use contraception. As you've previously heard, this is commonly referred to as reproductive coercion. And once someone in an abusive relationship becomes pregnant, the violence frequently escalates. In fact, more than 320,000 pregnant women are abused by their partner each year. And the odds of experiencing such abuse increases by 10% for each pregnancy. This leads to the alarming reality that homicide is now one of the leading causes of death during pregnancy. Therefore, denying access to critical health care, including abortion care, increases the danger a victim is in and decreases their ability to seek safety or leave their abusive partner. Banning access to abortion care could be a death sentence for people in abusive relationships. Reproductive autonomy is a chance to break the cycle of violence. Currently, up to 22% of pregnant people seeking abortions report that they are in an abusive relationship, and many report that the concern about continuing violence is the reason they decide to terminate their pregnancy. Those who report violence as a reason for abortion describe not wanting to expose children to violence and believing that having the baby will tether them to an abusive partner. Limiting access to abortion care simply increases the likelihood that victims will be forced to remain in the relationship and raise children in an increasingly abusive environment, thus continuing the cycle of violence. The rape and incest exception fails to protect the privacy and safety rights of domestic and sexual violence victims. Victims have the right to access abortion care without conditions. that require disclosure of their victimization to even a medical provider and mandatory reporting to law enforcement. Rape is a violent crime that removes all choice and control of a victim's body and can result in an unplanned and unwanted pregnancy that may tether the victim permanently to their rapist. Both domestic and sexual violence are intimate crimes that often go unreported due to shame, fear, or the relationship between the victim and the offender. In fact, in South Carolina, 92% of sexual assault victims had a prior relationship with the offender. So conditioning access to health care, including abortion care, on a victim's willingness or ability to disclose or report what happened causes unnecessary trauma, threatens their physical safety, and violates their state constitutional right to privacy and the rights guaranteed in the South Carolina Victims' Bill of Rights. Additionally, rape and incest exceptions simply fail to provide any protection for victims of domestic violence or reproductive coercion. As I've mentioned briefly a minute ago, restricting access to abortion care violates the state's constitutional rights of crime victims. As mentioned previously, the state constitution has an explicit right to privacy. But South Carolina's constitution also includes the South Carolina Victims' Bill of Rights. The Victims' Bill of Rights, set forth in Article 1, Section 24, was added to our state's constitution to preserve and protect victims' rights to justice and due process, regardless of race, sex, age, religion, or economic status. Restricting victim access to abortion or conditioning that access on reporting the crime to their doctor and law enforcement violates the victim's constitutional rights to be treated with fairness, respect, and dignity, to be free from intimidation, harassment, or abuse, and to be reasonably protected from the accused. In the aftermath of domestic or sexual violence, victims should not be forced to further jeopardize their privacy, health, physical safety, or their very lives in order to safely access abortion care. Whether you guys realize it or not, everyone in this room knows someone who has been a victim of intimate partner violence. We ask that instead of adding to their pain, you approach the issue with a sense of compassion and care for all those who've experienced violence and intimidation, and ensure that the laws that you pass are not the source of further harm. We ask that you join us in protecting the health, safety, and lives of victims of domestic violence and sexual assault by maintaining their broad access to abortion care. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr.